Down here in the stacks at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, I'm holding in my hand a book that comes pretty well as close to Shakespeare's family life as any other. It's by a doctor. Its title page reads, "Select Observations on English Bodies or Cures, both empirical and historical, performed upon very eminent persons in desperate diseases. First written in Latin by Mr. John Hall, physician, living at Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, where he was very famous, as also in the counties adjacent, as appears by these observations drawn out of several hundred of his as choicest, and now put into English." Mr. John Hall, physician, living at Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire. John Hall was Shakespeare's son-in-law. And amazingly, one of the cures he mentions in his book was carried out on his own wife, on Shakespeare's daughter, Susanna. This is case number 19 in Hall's book. "Mrs. Hall of Stratford, my wife, being miserably tormented with the colic, was cured as follows. Re diaphan diacatholic anna ounce 1 hoc and 3-2 lact q f clit. This injected gave her 2 stools, yet the pain continued, being but little mitigated. Therefore I appointed to inject a pint of sack made hot. This presently brought forth a great deal of wind, and freed her from all pain to her stomach, and was applied then a plaster, de labt cratac cum caran et spec aromat rosat et olmarcis, which one of these clysters I delivered, with which one of these clysters I delivered the Earl of Northampton from a grievous colic." So what Hall is doing here is putting together medical concoctions and producing, first of all, a drink and then a clyster to purge all the illness out of his wife. And he says he successfully performed the same operation on the Earl of Northampton. And it gives you a glimpse of the way in which herbal medicine was still so crucial in Shakespeare's England. One of the things he speaks of here, speculum aromatum rosatum. Aromatum rosatum was a concoction of no fewer than 15 different herbs and spices, all ground together. Mace, cinnamon, cardamom. It sounds like a kind of Elizabethan curry, and it certainly seems to have had the effect in getting a great deal of wind out of his colicky wife. So doctors did have a degree of success with physical conditions through this combination of bleeding, purgation, and the various forms of herbal remedy. But what about mental health? Could anything be done in that regard? We saw in Andrew Baude's Breviary of Health, describing the nature of madness, that he distinguished between the temporary heat of a fever and true insanity. What remedy was there for insanity, he asked. He said, well, there's very little that can be done. One thing you should do is make sure that the patient is put in a room where they cannot harm themselves or anybody else. But he also says it should be a room where there are no paintings or painted cloths on the wall, because one doesn't want the imagination of the insane patient to be further inflamed by things that they might see. Towards the end of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, who was so strong on the night of the murder, has become a mere shell, a shadow of her previous self. She is haunted by the memory of the murder. Famously, she comes on sleepwalking, rubbing her hands, trying to get the spot of blood off her hands. And of course she can't get it off because it isn't really there. It's in her imagination. "How does your patient, doctor?" asks Macbeth. "Not so sick, my lord," replies the doctor, "as she is troubled with thick-coming fancies that keep her from her rest." That's why Andrew Baude says you don't want to have paintings in the chamber of a victim of madness, because they will give them more fancies, more ideas. Cure her of that, says Macbeth. Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart? So there, Macbeth is taking all those physical cures that John Hall used for the colic, the idea of plucking something out from the body, erasing something, applying an antidote, cleansing the bosom. All those things that physically could be done for a colic, can you do them mentally for a memory? Well, of course, you can't. The doctor replies, therein the patient must minister to himself. To which Macbeth replies dismissively, throw physic to the dogs, I'll none of it. There's a limitation to what medicine can do. It's very interesting that in Macbeth and a couple of the other plays written around the same time, written shortly after Shakespeare's daughter had married John Hall, that Shakespeare became interested in doctors and the idea of the possibility of health being restored become quite a theme in the plays. But in the case of the madness of Lady Macbeth, the doctor is insufficient. And soon after this, of course, she dies. We do not know whether it's suicide, exactly what has happened. And Macbeth's response is very calm. The Queen, my lord, is dead, he's told. She should have died hereafter, says Macbeth. There would have been a time for such a word. And then he goes into his great speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Creeps on this petty pace from day to day, in which he compares life, human life, to being a poor player, strutting and fretting an hour upon the stage, and then we are heard no more. Macbeth has become phlegmatic, even as he comes close to death himself. So what we see from these passages is that knowing a bit about the medicine of Shakespeare's time, like knowing a bit about witchcraft beliefs in Shakespeare's time, make us see something of the complexity of the way in which in Macbeth Shakespeare explores questions of what is real and what is imaginary. And of course the extra layer of exploration that is always there is revealed to us by Macbeth comparing life to being a play. We are all but poor players. Because in the end, however much the characters on stage debate, are the witches real? Is the dagger real? Is this a momentary frenzy or true madness? Is the ghost of Banquo really there or not? In the end, of course, the whole of the play is something that's made up, something that is imaginary, something that is invented. It is a fiction, but it's a fiction that tells deep truths about human nature, and deep truths that were of particular interest to King James as he would have sat in the audience at court performances.